water has been used to convey logs to the sawmill and has long been a practice on the Columbia River south of Golden, British Columbia. It began around 1890 when the forests close to Golden had been logged off. This meant that the logging companies had to move further and further out in order to supply the lumber giant with a steady supply of logs. Trees were cut down in the winter and horses were used to skid the logs either to a railway or to the nearest river. Once they were in the river, they could easily be floated to the sawmills. Sometimes the standing timber was downstream of the river, and they would have to haul the logs up past the mills so that they could be floated down with a great deal of ease. The Columbia River Lumber Company used this method of moving logs from the reaches of its berth or license, including up the Spillimacheen River. After the forest fire of 1926 raged through the timber limits of the Columbia River Lumber Company, the company folded up, leaving room in the valley for another large mill. Alton had a pretty nice setup with the steam-driven mill and two planers between the river and the railway. The two planers were water-powered with Pelton wheels driving a line shaft which drove the planers and associated machinery. He established a lumber yard in Calgary to get his lumber to market and employed several locals to truck the product to the city. In 1940, tragedy struck and the mill, one of the planers, and about 5 million board feet of lumber were lost to fire. Unfortunately, uninsured, the loss was a heavy blow, and in order to rebuild, Alton had to get financial help. The new mill was built on the same spot at the river's edge and was larger and more modern, and although it was still steam-powered. The sawmill had a jack ladder for bringing the logs up out of the river. The mill had an in-feed deck, a waterless carriage with two riders on the carriage, one on the dogging and setting and the other one just dogging. A twin turbine ran the carriage cable feedworks. In 1950, Thomas Alton of Parson, BC, sold his interests in his logging and lumbering operation at Parson to Cranbrook Sawmills Limited. The deal included 298 acres at Parson, on which was located two stationary sawmills producing 50,000 feet daily, a planer mill with two planers, an office, garage, store, gas pumps, bunkhouse accommodations for 25 men, 20 individual company houses, an electric light plant, and the Alton timber berth up the Spillimacheen River. Cranbrook Sawmills was started by the partnership of Alfred Farstad, president of the firm, and Donald Burns, both of Cardston, and now also Fred Barr of Cranbrook, former partner in the Barr and Kennelly Lumber Company, and Frank Putnam of Creston. River drives continued on the Spillimacheen River until 1956. Each year, the loggers would head into the bush in the dead of winter and cut the standing timber, which would be moved to the closest stream to get it to the Spillimacheen River. The trees were stockpiled along the way, preparing for the spring runoff. Most of the trees were cut in the bush to 16-foot lengths, making it easier to move. While putting the logs in the river seems like an efficient way to move them the 60 miles they had to go, it was really costly. The company only got paid for logs that made it to the mill, and many logs got hung up along the way in big jams, and it took an immense amount of effort to get the jams broken up. In fact, everything about the log drive had to be perfect to get to the logs to the mill. If the water was too low, the logs would jam into the bottom of the river and cause jams. If it was too high, the water ran too fast, the logs would be hard to boom and would hop over the river banks into the surrounding sloughs. Skilled men on the log jams with long pike poles were kept busy pushing on the logs until they broke free, and then they had to carefully dance their way to the next part of the jam. The last drive on the Upper Columbia began in the spring of 1956. It was also the biggest drive, partly because it was also handling up to 2 million feet of previous season's logs that went astray, and partly because it was bringing down the last season cut, which was decked up to 8.5 million feet, while proper river conditions were awaited. Gordon Barr was the logging contractor at the Summit Lake Camp, where a second camp had been opened. Preparations for the 1956 drive started in early May, when bulldozers began cleanup work on jams and difficult navigation stretches. Sudden hot weather for 3 weeks in May brought the river up prematurely, and 5 bulldozers and 21 men were rushed onto the job in the Spillimacheen in an effort to keep the log drive going during this runoff jackpot. The bulldozers were used to push the jams back into the river and to remove the obstacles that caused the problems so that the logs wouldn't hang up there again. Logs churned through the white water, piled up on the bends, and battered off their bark through the gorge for 2.5 weeks. Then the water dropped about June 1st. This left some of the drive stranded in the Spillimacheen, and a double drum winch was riffed along the Columbia to break the jams that the rush created. The drive foreman was Hugh McPherson, and he said that the water would come up again, and in July it did. That is why the annual spring drive was still going on in August, when, with rear drive operations to recover strays of 1955 and previous seasons. 2 miles above the sawmill, a shear boom across the Columbia shunted logs into backwaters which were filled, and a series of 3 catch booms across the river at the sawmill held the rest. A lot was going on for Cranbrook sawmills in 1956. They were preparing to drive the timber to the mill, building a more modern sawmill across the tracks between the railway and the river, and this new mill would not be water-powered, and the company was building logging roads. The broad, well-constructed access highway was started before the drive began its final year. The road would extend for 32 miles to the south and west of Parson, encompassing most of the Spillimacheen River drainage, the North Fork, Middle Fork, and the South Fork. Its grades and elevation were reasonable, and it was surfaced with crushed rock and gravel where necessary, with the objective of year-round use. The company then purchased their own trucks with trailers to haul the logs from the bush to the mill. This new road would mean that the old method of driving the logs down the river were no longer necessary, and brought to an end almost 60 years of river driving on the Upper Columbia River. We are grateful to the talented photographer Charles Wormington for his exceptional work in capturing this river drive from the upper reaches of the Spillimacheen River all the way down to the mill at Parson. Charlie lived in Kimberley, and over the years that he lived and worked there, he practiced photography and even took courses in California so that he could hone his craft even further. While we were doing our research on this project, we found out that Charlie didn't even drive. So all of the fantastic things that he filmed throughout his lifetime were filmed because he stuck his thumb out and asked for a ride. He would ask people, "Oh, are you going in that direction?" And he would catch a ride. It's a pretty fantastic way to capture the events and the times and days that he managed to do. Charlie heard about the last river drive, and he had the opportunity to catch a ride, so that's what he did. And he managed to talk the company into allowing him to go into the backcountry with them and watch the operation so that he was able to film it. And we are really grateful for all of his work. He passed away a few years ago and left instructions that this film should come to the Golden Museum so that we could put it together and share it with everyone. And we hope that you've enjoyed this.